Tevinter Nights, Murder by Death Mages, by Caitlin Sullivan Kelly, and read by Kyle Bond. Damned statues. She had always hated them. Hated the over-exaggerated poses, hated the reminders of impossible achievements constantly hanging over everyone. Hated how people worshipped and prayed at what was nothing more than pretty hunks of stone. She hated them when she was young and alone, cowering in alleyways and begging for scraps while other children played with toy swords in the monument's shadows, shouting over who got to be which famous dragon hunter, crowing as they slew imaginary archdemons. When she joined the Inquisition, Sidony believed she'd never have to walk the streets of Nevarra City again. Never have to see the vacuous nobles waste good coin on frivolity and shallow attempts at dressing the monuments to their ancestors prettier than their rivals could dress theirs. But here she was, pushing through clustered knots of artists and florists and actors bustling about the garish things with enough flowers, candles, and drapes to fill every chantry in Thedas. She'd never cared for the pageantry of this tradition, or understood why the rich and powerful spent so much to revere their dead. The dead were all the same, just food for scavengers or tools to use in battle. If the nobility thought retelling the heroic triumph of their bloodlines year after year meant they shared in those accomplishments, they were mistaken. Nevarran nobles weren't good for anything anymore, except maybe Cassandra Pentagast. Sidony had found it amusing how Pentagast's brow furrowed as she read the letters Sidony had brought to her. She couldn't say she had felt the same kind of alarm when she had first received it. Pentagast's concerns had been so great that she immediately whisked the letter away to a meeting with the other Inquisition leaders. They could not easily overlook claims that the Mortalitasi, one of the influential and highly respected mages charged with tending Nevarra's dead, was planning to assassinate a member of Nevarra's already unstable line of succession, especially when those claims came straight from another Mortalitasi, one that Sidony once knew. Later, Pentagast, bearing her usual grave expression, had summoned Sidony to the Inquisition's war room with a simple order: return to Nevarra City and put an end to the Mortalitasi's plot, quietly, and before further intervention was required. Sidony had protested. She had no desire to set foot in that place ever again. There are other Nevarrans in the Inquisition. Send one of them. None of the other Nevarrans have your intimate knowledge of the Mortalitasi, Pentagast reminded her. And none of the other Nevarrans would rather feed themselves to a wyvern than return to Nevarra City, Sidony replied. Any mage in the Grand Necropolis could be involved. If we send anyone else to question Lord Henrik, do you think he would trust that they were not sent to silence him? I don't care, Sidony spat. I have no interest in getting mixed up in whatever diplomatic scuffle is brewing between the Mortalitasi and the nobles. The matter is simpler than you're making it out to be, Sidony. Pentagast's voice began to echo off the ceiling of the war room. Go to the Grand Necropolis, learn which Mortalitasi is this would-be assassin, and then stop them. There is already so much tension among the royal families. Something like this could be what tips the whole country into chaos. The Inquisitor does not wish to see that happen to Nevarra. Not if we can stop it. That doesn't sound simple to me. Pentagast sighed. Our only lead has asked for you, and you will be the one to go. That is an order. Sidony had snatched the letter out of Pentagast's hands before turning to go. Lord Henrik has put himself in a precarious position by informing us of this. Do you really not wish to help him? Pentagast had asked. He saved you, raised you, taught you what you know. Mortalitasi does not save anyone. Anything that isn't a corpse just gets in their way. You should know that better than anyone, Seeker. It was the last thing Sidony had said before storming out through the war room's massive door. Those words echoed in Sidney's head as she continued down the bustling street, louder and louder until she had to duck into an alleyway, out from under the stony glares of the statues. The more she looked at them, the more they twisted and contorted, until all she could see was the vacant face of Henrik's lifeless body. He got in the Mortalitasi's way, but which one? She leaned against the cool stone wall of the alley, deep in the slanting shadows cast by the setting sun, and let out a harsh breath. Her teeth clenched as a memory filled her vision. One of her, deep in the grand necropolis, standing next to a granite table used to prepare the dead for their internment. She balled her hands into shaking fists and pressed them to her eyelids, fighting against the sight of Henrik's withered body on the table. But no matter how hard she fought, the memory of his mangled limbs and his skin drained of all color would not leave her mind. She bent forward at the waist, remembering how she had demanded the other Mortalitasi tell her what had happened, how their voices had shouted over her questions, desperate to stop the scene she was making. The accusations and threats she had hurled, even as they grabbed her by the arms and forced her from the necropolis, did nothing to make them tell her what she wanted to know. About what had happened to Henrik. About anything he might have known about the assassins scheming in the shadows, poised to strike. An assassin hidden well within the ranks of the powerful mages, considered nigh untouchable by most of Nevarra. The matter is simpler than you're making it out to be, Sidony. Simple. Except for the fact that the Mortalitasi refused to answer any of her questions, and the only man who could have guided her to the killer was dead. With no one to turn to for answers, she had failed before she had even started. The sun slipped away into twilight. Sitting in the darkened alleyway, Sidony remembered another moment. She couldn't recall how old she had been at the time, or how long it had been since her mother had chased her from the home after discovering Sidney's magic. She had been curled up in an alley just like this one, struggling to conjure even the smallest spark to keep out the bitter cold, when an austere-looking man had bent down beside her and peered at what she was doing. She had scrambled away, thinking she had met her end. This man had come to imprison her, or kill her, or whatever else the rest of the world did to little girls with magic. "You're scaring the poor thing, Henrik," a bright-faced woman with hair the color of burnished brass had said from where she hovered in the alley's opening. "It's all right, Antonia. She just needs help," the man had replied. He stretched out his hand toward Sidony, and she tentatively leaned forward. A bright dancing flame burst from his palms, engulfing Sidony in warmth. Her first magic lesson. For all the years she had lived with Henrik after that, he had been a recluse, immersing himself in his studies within the necropolis, and in training Sidony. She searched her memories, and she couldn't think of a single person he had ever trusted, or even called a friend. Except for that mage, Antonia, in the alleyway that night. If she was the only person Henrik trusted enough to know that he had taken a young, cast-off mage from the streets, what other secrets had he confided in her? The woman was easy enough to find. A few Mortalitasi came into the city unless they were tending to the business of a death, and even fewer Mortalitasi matched Antonia's description. Sidony only had to ask a few people before she picked up on a trail. Each person she questioned was spellbound when they realized exactly who the old friend Sidony was looking for was. They eagerly pointed her to the place they saw the woman most, a nearby tavern, frequented by heavy gamblers. Night had completely fallen by the time Sidony found the place. Inside, she spotted Antonia instantly, dressed in unadorned burgundy robes and wearing the same bright face she saw that night Henrik found her. In the Inquisition, Sidony had witnessed a fair share of things that were odd or unexplainable. But seeing a death mage tucked away in the corner of a rowdy tavern, happily poring over a small stack of books, while the other patrons not so subtly watched from a respectful distance, was something else entirely. Sidony walked to the back of the dimly lit room, rolling her eyes as those she passed pretended not to stare over their cups. Wood scraped across stone as she roughly yanked the chair opposite the yellow-haired Mortalitasi, backward, and sat down. A man wearing a loose shirt and an apron rushed over, but one scornful look from Sidony sent him back behind the bar, Antonia's serene look lifted into a smirk as she flipped the next page of her book. A moment passed in silence, broken only by the sounds of scraping parchment, a wine goblet being picked up and put back down, and the soft murmur of conversation from the rest of the tavern. Words were difficult for Sidony on most occasions, and now she was really unsure how to begin. This woman may have been someone Henrik trusted, but she was still a Mortalitasi. What do you know? Who are your allies? What could she possibly ask that didn't give away who she was really looking for? Still silent as the grave. That hasn't changed, came the voice from the other side of the table. What? Sidony asked. The night that I met you, you refused to so much as say hello, the death mage replied, eyes still turned down toward her book. Henrik often told me how difficult it was raising a young girl who wouldn't open her mouth and speak. I speak when it's necessary. Sidony paused. How much time has passed since you've last seen me? More years than I can count, yet you still know me on sight. Antonia closed her book and smiled, not out of amusement. It was a calm and tranquil expression. Sidony, is it strange that I recognize a girl my very good friend used to tell me about every day? Henrik had his frustrations with you, especially about you choosing to run off and leave the Mortalitasi, but he had so many fun things to say about you too. Antonia placed her book on top of the pile before smoothing her long plait over the front of her shoulder. Sidony idly wondered how her hair had retained its hue after all these years. And honestly, Antonia chuckled, once you see that dark, soured face expression of yours, it's hard to forget. That part hasn't changed much either. I have no interest in trading petty barbs with you, Sidony spat. If you know who I am, then you know why I'm here. I can probably guess, but please, elaborate. I'm enjoying your natural gift for conversation. Antonia's smile widened. Sidony sneered. She never expected this woman to freely give her the answers she needed, but she couldn't read anything about her, or what she knew about Henrik's suspicions, if she knew anything at all, or where her loyalties lay. Sidony could feel this lead slipping away, like she had when she discovered what had happened to Henrik. But if this woman had been Henrik's friend, shouldn't she be concerned about his fate? If Sidony could convince Antonia that she had returned to Nevarra City to learn what happened to him, play on her sympathies until she learned the truth, it could put her back on the assassin's trail. I'm here for Henrik. What happened to him? Sidony asked. I saw his body. That was no natural death. The others refused to tell me anything. Then they threw me out. Antonia frowned, and her eyes flicked away. Would you like to come to a party? She asked, looking back. Sidony worked her jaw and fixed her gaze squarely at the woman, trying to follow where she could possibly be leading. Her fists slowly clenched in her lap. No, I would not, she replied. Are you sure? The woman stood and gathered her few books under her arms. I'm certain you'd find it very entertaining. Sidony pushed back from the table and stood, her right fist flying behind her back, magic cracking and sparking in her palm. This woman would speak to her one way or another, and she didn't care who saw. I don't find much of anything entertaining. Parties least of all, Sidony said, as she stepped in Antonia's way, blocking her from leaving the table. You are not leaving until you answer my questions. Lady Antonia, is she bothering you? Should I remove her? The bartender, who had cleaned the same glass at least 6 times since Sidony first sat at the table, suddenly found the courage to approach the pair of mages. Antonia put up her free hand toward him. As amusing as it would be to see you try, I think you'd better let me handle this, she said. The barkeep's confidence faltered, and he hesitantly backed away. The knowing smile Antonia wore vanished as she closed the distance between them. When she was close enough that no one, not even the nervous bartender, could hear her, Antonia spoke.
If I just turn you loose, you'll get yourself killed.
Sidony relaxed her fist, and the tingle of magic subsided. Antonia adjusted her books and said, just as quietly,
Someone in this city has made a name for himself, turning over every stone in Nevarra, unearthing debauchery and corruption for any who can pay for it.
Turning Sidony toward the door, Antonia guided her gently through the room. Eyes openly stared over rims of cups and over the tops of cards as they walked, the pretense of minding their own business abandoned long ago.
No one's secrets are safe from him, she continued. Not the rich, not the powerful, not even those who hide down in the deepest depths of the necropolis. If someone is hiding something from you, he can help you learn what it is.
They stepped into the chilly dark, and Antonia released Sidony.
In front of the statue of Tilis van Markham, the one by the river, there is a manor with a red door. Be there tomorrow evening.
For a brief moment, Antonia regarded her with a serious look. Then she turned and walked back up the avenue, flickering candles at the base of the monuments lighting the path in front of her feet. Damned statues. The sun had fallen below the river's opposite shore when Sidony finally stepped from behind the towering relief of Tilis van Markham. With the hood of her raiment pulled far around the sharp angles of her face, she had watched the guests as they filed into the smooth stone manor across the boulevard. The men and women attending the fete were dressed in fine garments and flaunting more jewels than the richest dwarven merchant. Sidony marched toward the manor's entrance, tugging her hood away from her face and smoothing back her chin-length brown hair. Straightening her robes and wiping the city's grime from her mantle did nothing to make her look as extravagant as the other revelers, but at least she wouldn't stand out as much, as she quietly slipped into the back of the raucous group of guests bursting through the front door. She barely had a chance to take in her surroundings in the imposing entryway before a yellow-haired blur swung her into an adjoining room. Antonia grabbed her arm before the defensive spell that leapt into Sidony's mind could make its way to her fingertips.
"It's me!"
Antonia hissed. Sidony calmed the spark of magic before stepping back and yanking her arms out of Antonia's grip.
"I apologize,"
Antonia said, doing a poor job of stifling a laugh as she looked over Sidony.
"But you stood out the moment you stepped inside the door. I didn't want you to draw too much attention."
Antonia's deep blood-red coat was designed to facilitate quick movement. The front cut to a length that put her black leather leggings and black boots on full display. Silver bangles twisted and coiled up her one bare arm, and despite the ensemble utilitarian quality, she was every bit as elegant and refined as the other nobles. She seemed as comfortable here as she was in the tavern.
"And being shoved into a private chamber by Mortalitasi dressed like a spindleweed bunch won't draw attention?" Sidony asked. "No more than usual. Everyone's used to that sort of thing at these parties."
That serene smile crept along Antonia's face, as if she were merely explaining the ways of the world to an ignorant child. Sidony rolled her eyes.
"Enough. I told you. I don't like parties, and I'm not here for fun. Tell me where I can find this secret dealer you mentioned."
Antonia sighed.
"He's upstairs, flitting from crowd to crowd like a butterfly and pretending that no one notices him listening in. The lords and ladies feign disgust at his brazen eavesdropping to make their rivals believe that no one here would dare even speak to him."
"I'm not interested in their games," Sidony sneered. Her fists clenched and unclenched a few times.
"It's part of it. They all turn around and whisper their gossip to him when they are sure no one is listening. Open a book on Navarran's royal families and point to any name. By the end of the night, he'll have pieced together enough of a scandal to bring them down. I'm sure he could blackmail the entirety of King Marcus's court if he wanted to. Maybe even the king himself, if he were lucid enough to know he was being extorted. If anyone can find the truth about what happened to Henrik, he can."
Or, Sidony thought, he can tell me which one of you is a murderer, and which useless noble is the prey. Antonia removed a ring from her hand, a large ruby cradled in a silver setting, detailed with what looked like finger bones, and slipped it onto Sidony's finger.
At least try to look like you belong here.
She again smiled. Flexing her fingers, Sidony flattened her lips into a line as she toyed with the unfamiliar weight.
Do you do this often? She asked. Drink in taverns while you study, revel with hypocritical nobles and their information dealers? I don't remember many Mortalitasi leaving the necropolis for these kinds of social calls. It's gotten a bit too quiet down there for me in recent years.
Antonia's smile widened.
I've grown to prefer livelier settings.
No serious answer, then, Sidony thought. She turned and opened the ornately carved door. Music and the sounds of a lively debate between nearby guests spilled into the room.
When the dead are brought to us,
Antonia said,
I feel regret.
Sidony stopped in the doorframe and looked at her. Antonia's smile was gone, replaced by a far-off look.
Regret that I'd never known these people in life. What drove them? What terrified them? What killed them? The people of Nevarra hold the Mortalitasi in very high regard. They admire us. They appreciate our knowledge and our counsel, and they respect the important role we play in this country. Too many of my colleagues repay their confidence with avoidance.
Antonia walked a few paces forward, looking straight into Sidony's face.
I am trying to tend more to the living, to get to know them and let them get to know me. They deserve to believe I'm not only interested in getting my hands on their corpses one day. I do what I can to assure them of that. Even if it's, how did you describe it? Reveling with the hypocrites?
She glided past Sidony into the entrance hall.
Wait upstairs. I'll make sure our man finds you,
she said, before disappearing into the party. Sidony couldn't understand Antonia's desire to ingratiate herself with the people of Nevarra City. If she could have it her way, she would leave the vapid creatures to fend for themselves, put them miles behind her on the road out of Nevarra. But she'd be lying if she said she didn't understand Antonia's feelings of regret. Regrets like unfinished business, an assassin slipping through her fingers, or words she'd never gotten to say to a dead man down in the necropolis. She considered slamming the door as she entered the party, but that would draw too much attention. Men and women excitedly hurried past Sidony as she ascended the wide staircase. Upstairs, the party was even livelier than it was below. Styles of music from instruments she'd never even heard filled each room as she passed. Laughter and cheers erupted from tables of card games. Couples danced, and men slapped each other on the back. And everywhere she looked was another rich spread of food and drink. Sidony moved to the outer edges of the raucous crowds. Enormous portraits in gilded frames loomed above her as she kept close to the walls. She spotted an empty out-of-the-way oriel, with delicately paned windows that would serve as a quick escape if things turned desperate. It was the perfect place to wait for Antonia's so-called scandal maker. The rowdy guests were too preoccupied to notice an unaccompanied woman keeping her distance from the entertainment, glowering at them as they danced and embraced and strolled, watching their faces for any sign of who she was looking for. Hours passed in that corner without any sign from the secret dealer, or even Antonia. No one had even glanced in her direction. Her frustration at once again losing control of the search was suffocating. Inhaling sharply, she turned and glared down on the street below, considering her next move. Dozens of candles burned at the base of that repulsively opulent Tillis van Markham statue, casting a dim glow where she had hidden earlier that evening. There, just beyond the reach of the candle's light, barely visible, was a figure, standing as still as the statue itself. She could feel magic radiating from the dark form, cold sensations of death that, even from this distance, made the hair on her arms stand on end. She watched the shadow where it lurked, waiting for it to move. Sickening, isn't it? Sidony tore her eyes away and turned. A young man dressed in an ornately patterned coat looked past her to the street below. Her face twisted into a frown and the man laughed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said. "I was talking about that irritatingly ostentatious statue. I would wager Tillis Van Markham never found an occasion to pose like that." Sidony turned her back and looked down again. The dark figure had disappeared, and she felt her body tense in annoyance. The man behind her didn't seem to notice, or he didn't care. "I'm so sick of that pretentious shrine. We can't even walk the streets in peace without the Van Markhams' constant, desperate reminders that their station is far above our own. If they lived in the present like the rest of us, maybe they'd have more to contribute to the country than plotting against every other noble family in between drunken alley spats." "I don't give a shit about the Van Markhams," Sidony threw over her shoulder. The disgust dripped from his voice. "A Pentagast woman, then." Sidony barked out a laugh. If only the Pentagast woman responsible for her being here could see this. "No," she snapped as she faced him. "I am not a Pentagast woman, and I am not a Van Markham woman. I have more important things to consider myself with than that century-old pissing match." "Interesting," the man smirked. "Right now, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in Nevarra who thinks anything is more important than that." He rubbed his chin and asked, "When our frail king is gone, with no one to succeed him, do you think the Pentagasts and Van Markhams will continue their squabble over the rightful heir in spirited discussions behind closed doors?" Just as she started to tell him she'd grown tired of his manifesto, her eyes leapt to his crimson gloves as he tugged at their cuffs. Expensively made like the rest of his clothes. Anyone could tell, even at first glance. Intricate stitching in the shape of a quill bloomed from the seams. Although Henrik had never prepared her for interacting with them, he had heavily emphasized learning about the royal families of her country, their tumultuous histories, their acrimonious rivalries, their ever-changing status within the king's court. As much as she had tried to resist the lessons, many details still managed to sink in. Enough at least for her to know that a quill was the heraldry of House Reinhardt, a minor family but one of the oldest in Nevarra. The branches of the family tree stretched into the neighboring free marches and into Orlais, but they never held much influence over their own nation. "No," the man continued, oblivious to her silence. "They'll drag their war into the streets. Good people will fight and die for arrogant families who have no interest in listening to the rest of us." "Damn it, Antonia," Sidony thought as she searched the crowd for an opening to escape the chattering windbag. Too much time had been wasted. She'd have to find a way forward in her pursuit, without the scandal-maker's help. And the longer they bicker, the longer the kingdom has no heir. The longer they allow those damn Mortalitasi to circle the king like vultures, whispering in his ear. Sidony's eyes snapped back to the Reinhardt lord. A man drunk enough or stupid enough to shout accusations that the death mages were ruling the kingdom through manipulation was a man who might let slip rumors about a Mortalitasi assassin's plan to remove a noble family from play, if he wasn't a target himself. With no heir, the throne will sit empty, just waiting for those damn death mages to slither in and... A man quickly walking past them bumped into Reinhardt, cutting off the next part of his commentary. The glass he'd been holding fell to the ground. A servant appeared as if from nowhere to collect it and disappeared just as quickly. "The Mortalitasi?" Sidony prompted in an attempt to regain his attention, impatience eating away at her. "Yes, Nicholas, tell us about those terrifying death mages. Tell us all about how they've infiltrated the king's chambers, how they've made themselves the secret rulers of Nevarra." A mocking voice rang out as a pair of graceful hands brushed off Reinhardt's jacket and straightened his shirt. "I was about to," Reinhardt scowled as he batted the man's hands away. "But it seems there's not much left to say now that you've blurted it all out, Siros." Siros laughed, and Sidony glared at the interruption. He was dressed as well as most of the noblemen here, almost as lavishly as Reinhardt. His thick honey-colored curls were slicked back and in a way that almost fully hid the tapered point of his ears. An elf in such finery, mocking and touching a member of old Nevarran nobility, no one batting an eye. This was someone welcomed with open arms and stacks of gold in circles fueled by secrets and scandal. "Nicholas, you're neglecting your other guests." Siros wagged a scolding finger at Reinhardt. "You shouldn't deny the rest of them your grand vision for the future of Nevarra." He turned to Sidony and offered his arm, smiling. She folded her arms in response, and his smile widened into an unsettling grin. "No." He pulled his arm away. "Well, if you prefer, I can certainly let you get back to enjoying Lord Reinhardt's captivating opinions. But someone tells me you and I have business to discuss." "My drink's gone anyway," Reinhardt grumbled as he took his leave. Siros extended his arm again, and Sidony took it. The red stone in the ring Antonia gave her glinted in the crook. They walked with purpose, pushing through the crowd at a brisker pace than the meandering strolls of the other guests. Their faces lit up as they saw Siros approach them. Many nodded their regards, and a few even bowed. Sidony glanced sidelong at his beaming face. He acknowledged each and every soul they passed, with a knowing smile of kindred spirits sharing a secret. What did he know about them? Anything at all? Were they just potential customers, or potential marks? Are you allowed to call every nobleman in Nevarra by their first name? Or is there something special between you and Lord Reinhardt? Sidony asked. Siros chuckled as he saluted a woman with the tallest hair Sidony had ever seen. "I'm allowed to call anyone by any name I want," he said. "If I get it wrong, no one ever corrects me." They're afraid to. People were intimidated by Sidony for many reasons. Because she was an agent of the Inquisition. Because she was a mage no longer chained to any circle of magi. Because she was a woman far from what one could call approachable. But no one had ever been so scared that they couldn't correct her when she was wrong. This elf had power that made people who should fear nothing tremble in his presence. "We shouldn't stay out in the open like this. There are lots of eager ears around. Besides mine," he said with a wink. He steered them into an unoccupied alcove and planted himself in front of her, his back to the party, his hand against the wall, and his outstretched arm barring her from flight. To the guests outside, they would have looked like any other couple taking advantage of the alcove's privacy. "I saw you earlier at the window. You looked like you were waiting for someone," Siros said. "It couldn't have been Nicholas. You looked like you could hardly wait to snap your fingers and light his pompous ass on fire." "And how would I do that?" Sidony replied as flatly as possible. "I'm certain a mage as skilled in necromancy as you could figure something out. Probably something even more imaginative than flame, I'm betting." Sidony pursed her lips. "Antonia." Siros laughed. "I've worked with plenty of mages. The lot of you all have the same tells. There's a certain draw that you all just haven't figured out how to hide." "Have any of the mages you've worked with been Mortalitasi?" He narrowed his eyes. "I can't say I've had the pleasure, no. Not in the way I've worked with other mages. But I get an earful about them almost daily." "You heard Nicholas. Every fool in Nevarra has an opinion about the Mortalitasi. Half the people think they were sent by the Maker himself to save the kingdom from civil war. The other half will tell you about their secret rituals and mind control experiments." Sidony rolled her eyes. "Very interesting. But I'm looking for a particular death mage." Siros raised an eyebrow and waited. Sidony huffed. "Someone in the Grand Necropolis wrote to me. He said he made some very serious accusations against another Mortalitasi. Now he's dead. I need to know if someone is responsible for that." "And what's stopping you from marching down into their lair and interrogating every one of them until you find what you were looking for?" "I tried, but..." Henrik's twisted face flashed through her mind, and the words died on her tongue. "It doesn't matter. Whoever did this has to be stopped." "Stopped? From doing what?" Sidony scoffed. She'd hoped to avoid telling him anything more than what she'd led Antonia to believe. But she needed options, and he wasn't one of them. If she played her cards right, she could tell him the truth without alerting the assassin that she was coming. And maybe if he understood that the lives of the people who provided his employment were the ones at stake, he'd be more likely to help. One of them, a Mortalitasi, is planning to murder a noble. Ciro started to say something, and stopped. His mouth pressed into a line and his head ticked to the side. Planning? He asked. I think you're too late to stop them several times over. What? Sidony bit out, irritation spiraling inside of her. 4 nobles dead in the past week, Ciro said, as he crossed his arms. His jovial demeanor had faded, replaced by a stern and contemplative look. The annoyance flooding through Sidony turned to anger. At every turn was a reminder of her failure to her duty. She narrowed her eyes at Cyros and snapped. And what proof do you have that these nobles were killed by the Mortalitasi? None, he replied unabashedly. They died by... He ticked each method off on his fingers. A hunting mishap, 2 falls, and in one poor sod's case, too much wine. Deaths like that aren't exactly uncommon in wealthy Nevarran houses, and if the family believes it was an accident, the city guard won't investigate. But he turned and looked out over the guests, to where Reinhardt was spilling something from his cup as he addressed the enraptured groups of partygoers. If these accidents happen within days of each other, to nobles who are notorious for speaking out against the king's Mortalitasi advisors, and the Mortalitasi keep carting off the bodies before anyone can get a good look at them, it's hard not to take notice. He faced her again. And when a mage shows up on your doorstep saying she's hunting a noble-killing Mortalitasi, it's hard not to get suspicious. And how are you so acquainted with the details of these deaths? Cyros laughed. Antonia told you who I am, didn't she? What I do? There isn't much I don't know. And when I know someone is targeting my clients, I won't sit and wait for it to happen again. Especially not when the Maker himself sends such a capable woman to help me. Before Sidony could answer, the sound reached her. A scream, just barely audible over the deafening sound of the party. Over and over, like someone having the life pulled from their body piece by piece. Sidony shoved Cyros out of the mouth of the alcove and tore into the crowd. She shouldered her way past the drunk and foolish guests stumbling around her, searching for the direction of the scream. Mage! Cyros caught up to her, just as she reached the landing of the grand staircase. He snatched her arm, turning her around to face him. Was it something I said? Stop it, she hissed, knocking his hand away from her. Listen. All around them, mouths began murmuring in ears. Heads turned in all directions as others started to notice the sound. Gawkers leaned over the railings and pointed down to the floor below. She turned and hurried down the steps across the main hall, weaving in and out of the gaps left by the huddling guests. The screams turned into wails bouncing from the walls of a dark corridor avoided by the guests. Sidony turned down the hall and saw her, a young, terrified maid pulling at her own hair and howling into an open door. By the time she reached her, the girl had collapsed. Sidony stepped over her crumpled body, her boots clacking on the polished marble as she peered into the room beyond. The lavishly furnished sitting room was dark and silent. There were no signs anyone had been here, except for a sputtering flame in the fireplace, and the dead man face down in the middle of the floor. Poor Nicholas is absolutely beside himself. Sidony closed her eyes against the sun's reflection on the water and sighed as they walked past another dock. If I were forced to choose between eating that rat over there and being considerate of Nicholas Reinhardt's feelings, I would eat the rat. Come now, Cyros laughed. Have some sympathy. Someone was murdered in the man's home last night. Exactly, Sidony spat. You saw the body. The state it was in. Something had been done to it. Something that gave it the same sickly, twisted appearance as Henrik's corpse. And Reinhardt threw me out with the rest of the gawkers when I tried to get a closer look. she continued. "Forgive me if I cannot manage to harbor any kindness for him." After Reinhardt had unceremoniously tossed out everyone from the party, the servants had ushered the discontented guests into the streets with the assurance that the death was merely an unfortunate bit of luck. An accident. The same thing the families of the other victims were desperate for everyone to believe. "He does have to keep up appearances," Ciro said, as if he could read her thoughts. "It will go badly for Nicholas if the most powerful people in Nevarra think he allows assassins to strike under his own nose. Better for them to believe that old Lord Hildebrand simply overexerted himself with that maid, and let his house deal with the scandal."
Last night I couldn't get Reinhardt to shut up about the Mortalitasi. Now that his ego is involved, suddenly he has no interest in stopping them.
"And that's what people do, mage." Siros fell into step behind her, and cast her a sidelong glance. "Before long, the throne of Nevarra will be free for the taking, and when every royal-blooded family from here to Cumberland thinks they have a chance at it, they'll do anything to increase their chances. Right now, being nobility in this kingdom means knowing everything that could bring down your rivals. But more importantly, it means controlling what your rivals know about you. Besides, Nicholas runs his mouth so much about the Mortalitasi, he's bound to have a target painted on his back already. That target will get a lot bigger if he stands accusing one of them of murder. Best leave him to his delusions and let us figure out who's behind this. Starting with finding this ambitious little bastard who thinks he can get one over on my client." The night before, Siros had found Sidony in the throng of partygoers as they filed out of the manor. He had pulled her away into the night, away from curious ears, and made an offer. In exchange for telling her what he could learn about the Mortalitasi assassin, she would help him secure their first lead on the killer. Siros had a patron who had been the mistress of one of the recently slain nobles. Evidence of their affair, a journal, had fallen into the hands of the victim's servant, who was threatening to expose the scandal unless the patron paid him an unconscionable amount of gold. They had spent the morning combing the docks by the river, searching the places Siros had heard the upstart servant liked to visit, without any luck. It was an unusually warm day for the season, and the sun hung high overhead as they sat on a low wall to rest.
"I appreciate you helping me stop this assassin,"
Sidony sighed.
"but I am having trouble understanding how cleaning up these foolish messes for your noble pets is a valuable use of my time."
"I told you," Ciro smiled reassuringly. "My patron has information to trade, if we find the journal for her."
"I understand that part. But what could she possibly know that would be of any use to us?"
"So far, every victim's family has insisted that their deaths were accidental, despite their questionable nature. I haven't been able to piece together whether they're saying this to avoid shame or because someone is coercing them. Either way, none of them would dare risk putting themselves out of favor with the Mortalitasi by claiming one of them is responsible. My patron promised me that once she gets the journal, she'll tell us what she knows about the circumstances around her lover's fall. She doesn't believe the official story. She doesn't think it was an accident or by the lover's own hand. I think she knows something that'll give us a better lead than just waiting for another party, and using the nobles as bait." Sidony looked over the river. Her patience for the royal family's frivolities and squabbles was growing thin. So much so that using one of them as bait was starting to sound rather enticing.
"Who is this woman? Your patron? How do you know we can trust her?"
Ciro smiled again, the one that seemed to appear when he wanted her to stop asking questions. "That's not part of our deal, mage. Just as I won't tell my patron the secrets you're after, I won't betray her trust by exposing her."
"Stop calling me mage," Sidony snapped. "Would you like me to call you frustratingly shifty elf?"
"I guarantee you I've been called worse things," Siros laughed.
"I know this is all part of what you do," Sidony continued, "but the people I usually work with have the decency to not withhold knowledge from me. This blind confidence you expect is not something that is ever asked of me. I am not enjoying it.
Ah, there he is, Ciro said as he looked away and gestured to a young man walking past the market stalls across the plaza. His messy black hair stuck out of the hood of his coat, completely out of place in the warm weather. Sidony scowled as Ciros deflected her concerns. Perfect, he said as he stood and brushed off his pants and extended his hand to her. I was going to suggest using your special brand of magic, but that face you're making will put the fear of the maker into the poor boy. Let's go. They kept their distance as they followed him up the avenue. Artists and various entertainers were still hard at work, preparing and adorning the dozens of statues for the season. Their quarry weaved in and out of buzzing crowds.
What are we waiting for? Sidony asked. He's right there.
Too many people around, Ciros replied. I want him in a quieter place. Don't want to risk anyone else getting involved. The journal we're after might get snatched up in the wrong hands. Again. Silence settled between them as they walked. Sidony clasped her hands together and felt a foreign presence against her palm. She looked down and saw the angry red stone in the ring Antonia gave her the night before still blazing on her finger. In the chaos after Reinhardt had dismissed everyone from the party, she hadn't been able to find her. I have to ask, Ciros began. How do you know Lady Antonia? Sidony looked up at him and sighed. He put his hands up in defense. Can't help it. Part of the job and all. I don't know her, she replied. Interesting. The upstart servant they were tailing was no longer staring straight ahead. He looked in several directions before slipping into a side street. This way, Ciros said, as he pulled her into the alley closest to them. We'll come out the other side and catch him off guard. He'll notice us if we follow him down directly. They picked up their pace as they made their way through the deserted passageway. Do you often wear jewelry belonging to complete strangers? Ciros asked as he pointed to her hand. Strangers who just so happen to be very prominent and influential necromancers.
And how are you so well acquainted with Antonia?
I don't know her personally, just the bits and pieces. You know, the ones I've picked up through my work. She's very popular in many circles. Very well liked. Ciros thought for a moment. She seemed like a lively woman when she pointed me your way last night. She was very concerned about you. Sidony rolled her eyes.
She is a friend of someone I knew a long time ago. That is our only connection.
Your only connection? Other than the fact that you're both highly skilled death mages? Sidony shook her head.
I was supposed to be one of them. A Mortalitasi. Antonia's friend, Henrik, he took me in when I was a child. Taught me necromancy, death magic, the customs and history of Nevarra. Little else.
Sidony frowned as she remembered her days cooped up in the necropolis, hungry to learn more about magic in the world outside, longing to see the rest of Thedas. And Henrik, telling her to put those thoughts from her mind, that Nevarra City itself was dangerous enough, let alone anywhere else.
Henrik and Antonia always expected me to join them eventually, but...
But? Ciros asked. Sidony's patience spilled away like a tipped-over glass.
But obviously I didn't.
Ciros opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Sidony hissed,
Because I'm here with you, being pestered by annoying questions instead of catching a Mortalitasi assassin that keeps slipping through my fingers.
Ciros clamped his mouth shut and smiled. They fell into silence again, and soon they reached the other side of the alley. Wait. Ciros barred her with his arm and looked around the corner, in the direction of the alleyway where their target had disappeared. It's quiet enough here, he said, surveying the near-empty street. If he comes this way, pull him in. Time stretched as they waited for the servant to appear from the mouth of the other alley. So, Henrik, what happened to him?
Stop it,
Sidony barked.
Stop what?
I'm not one of the eager little rumor mongers you like to trade with. Is my past relevant to finding this assassin? Will it help you win the silly games you're playing with the nobility? Stop asking me." The rest of her words fell away. Her eyes were drawn over Cyrus's shoulder, to another grossly exaggerated statue some 30 paces away. Some Pentagast duke or another. Both its arms, raised in supplication, cast the street around it into shade, obscuring a motionless figure that radiated the same magic, the same cold impression of death that she had felt the night before she could will her feet to walk in its direction. She felt hands clamp on her shoulder and spin her around. "There!" Cyrus hissed in her ear. It was him, the servant they'd been chasing, walking away from them on the other side of the street. Sidony wrenched herself from Cyrus's grip and bolted toward him. The servant had just enough time to realize a determined-looking woman was racing in his direction before Sidony thrust her hand forward. A purplish-white flash of magic narrowly missed his back as he started to run. As she darted after him, she could faintly hear Cyrus's shouting and the pounding of his footsteps behind her. If he wanted her to stop, then he was about to be disappointed. She would not let another piece of this puzzle elude her. Before she could let another curse fly from her hands, the servant turned a sharp corner into a narrow alley between two storefronts. She heard a shout, Cyrus's voice close behind her. She looked over her shoulder, and he gestured for her to follow the servant before he slipped into a narrow passage a few dozen paces behind. She raced into the alley. The servant was nearing the other side. Gathering as much strength as she could, she stopped and focused on his retreating form, just as Cyrus appeared in the opening at the opposite end of the alley. She sliced her left arm in an arc in front of her. The servant screamed as the curse knocked him forward out of the alley. His hands flew to his head, batting away imagined monsters from the horror spell Sidony had inflicted on him. Cyrus caught him just as he began to collapse, and dragged the screaming man back into the alley, and Sidony ran forward to meet him. The servant's face looked like Henrik's had when she saw his corpse, pulled wide in a look of terror. "Stop his screaming," Cyrus ordered as he struggled to restrain their quarry. She pulled on her magic, attempting to wipe the spell from the man's mind. She tried again, and again, gritting her teeth against the energy draining from her body. But the more she tried, the louder he screamed, and the more she saw Henrik's face. "Mage, stop him!" "I can't," Sidony growled. "It's not working." The servant thrashed and forced his way out of Cyrus's arms. The man charged at Sidony, his shrieking face inches from hers, teeth gnashing and eyes wild. Suddenly, he was yanked backward by his hair, and his screams turned to gasps. Blood poured from his side as the spot where the knife in Cyrus's hand was buried. Cyrus released him, and the servant fell to the ground. Now that she could see him calm and up close, she realized he couldn't have been more than 20 years, and now his death was another she had failed to prevent. "What?" Sidony panted. "Why did you do that?" "I told you to make him stop," Cyrus said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and wiping at his hands. "If he'd kept it up, who knows what attention we would have drawn, especially after you decided to throw a few fistfuls of magic out in the open." Sidony stuttered. "I was about to." She waved her hand over the dead man, covered in his own blood. "This wasn't part of what you asked of me," she said forcefully. "Why did you do that?" He said nothing as she watched him pull his knife from the corpse and clean it. She said nothing as he rummaged inside the servant's coat until he found the journal they were looking for, and silence stretched between them as he pushed her out of the alley, back into the sunny main street. "Wait here," Cyrus said as they stood outside the front door of the elegant apartment. "No," Sidony said, snatching the journal from Cyrus's hand. "I need to hear what this woman knows." She crushed the book to her chest. "I need to hear it from her, not you." Cyrus shook his head. "You can't. She doesn't know you. She isn't expecting you." He reached for the book. She stepped back out of his grasp, clutching the journal with one hand. She held the other forward, open and palm up. "Do you want to see for yourself what that boy saw before you cut open his ribs?" she warned. He dropped his hand and sighed.
"Come on,"
he said, opening the door for her.
"After you,"
Sidony replied. The apartment was dark, despite it being in the middle of the afternoon. The expected noise from servants and visitors in an extravagant place like this was absent. No one appeared to greet them as they moved through the entryway.
"Are you sure this is where we were supposed to bring the journal?" Sidony asked.
"Yes," Siros said. "She told me to bring it here once I've found it. She could be out for the afternoon, but the entire household wouldn't go with her. Something's wrong." Sidony felt the prickle of magic ripple down her arm in response. When they crossed into the room, the magic flared when she saw the body, all shriveled limbs and colorless skin. Siros's face fell into a concerned frown. "Well, damn," he said, smoothing a hand through his hair.
"What do you mean, damn?"
Sidony said, more frantically than she would have liked. Siros smirked. "Are you all right, mage? With your skill set, I didn't think seeing something like this would unnerve you."
"Don't tell me this is who we were depending on."
"And if it is?" Siros asked before disappearing into the front hall. Sidony glared at the corpse, at this new proof of her failure.
Another witness silenced. One more step behind the killer. "I am growing tired of this assassin beating me at every turn," she said through gritted teeth, when Siros returned to the parlor.
"They haven't beat us yet," Siros said. "This is your chance, mage."
"What are you talking about?"
Sidony sneered. "No one's here. No one to shoo us away. No one to tip off the Mortalitasi to come and take the body. We need death magic." Sidony peered at the body, brow furrowed.
"If I do what you're suggesting, it won't be pretty."
"It's death magic. I wouldn't expect it to be." She shot him a glare. "Can't you just wake it up long enough to tell us what it saw?" Siros offered.
"That's not how it works. Getting a corpse to speak is a rare gift, even among the Mortalitasi."
"There has to be something you can try." Sidony regarded him for a moment. The Mortalitasi's methods weren't supposed to be known to anyone outside of the Order, and Maker only knew if she could even get this to work. But this could be their only opportunity to study one of the victims uninterrupted.
"I can call on a spirit from the Fade to possess the corpse. I've heard stories of spirits latching on to the final moments of the dead."
She paused, thinking back to the old rituals Henrik used to make her observe.
"There are certain tools the Mortalitasi use to attract a spirit to a corpse, tools that I do not have. And if I do not use the proper methods to invite a spirit into the body, it will be unpredictable. We can hope it's agreeable, but this thing will be just as likely to attack you as answer your questions."
"I don't think we have a choice right now," Siros reminded her. Sidony let out a breath and closed her eyes. She focused her magic, using it to reach into the Fade, the realm beyond, where spirits, demons, and departed souls reside. She searched for a spirit willing to occupy Siros's patron, if only for a brief moment, willing to confess her memories to them. Siros shouted as the fingers on the corpse's gloved hand started to flex. Sidony centered herself and pulled the spirit harder toward the dead. She was a breath away from fully waking it, when she noticed the embroidery on the glove as it lifted into the air. A quill. Pain exploded in the back of her skull, and everything went dark. "My wife, Siros! My wife!" The anxious voice lanced through the haze that was slowly lifting from Sidony's head. She willed her eyes to open, but they wouldn't. "Yes, your wife, Nicholas, and I'm sorry," came Siros's voice, and the rustle of clothing as one man shoved the other. "But if you don't take your hands off me, you'll be joining her." "Now you're threatening me," Reinhardt laughed. "How stupid could I have been?" "Pretty damn stupid if you think I was the one who did this." "What would you have me believe?" Reinhardt roared. I hired you to kill my rivals and take the Mortalitasi down with them, and now I find my wife slain by the assassin I employed, and one of the damned death mages herself." Sidony started at the confession and forced her eyes open. The room was unfamiliar, full of well-appointed furniture, but she recognized the same polished floor, red as a drakestone, and that of the room where they had discovered the body of Cyros's patron, Reinhardt's wife. She struggled to sit up and discovered her hands were bound behind her.
"Why would he have me raise your wife if he killed her?"
Her voice sounded weaker than she would have liked. The two men turned to Sidony in surprise. Reinhardt quickly recovered and he rushed forward, an accusing finger outstretched toward her. "Because he was using you, you disgusting witch! His job was to upend the Nevarran line of succession and blame it on people like you!" Reinhardt rounded on Cyros. "And because he's a killer, that's all he knows how to do. Give him a list of targets and he won't stop there. He can't control himself." Sidony looked to Cyros. He didn't deny it, but from the look on his face he was struggling with something unspoken.
The right words to talk his way out of this.
She looked to the ground. Her face grew hot at the idea that she had aided the very person she was sent to stop. Nicholas laughed, a biting, taunting sound. "You didn't know, did you? Who did you think he was? Who did you think you were helping?"
"A man who would kill a boy in broad daylight to silence him. A man with connections, with easy access to the victims and their families. A man who the most powerful people in Nevarra City both feared and admired."
The pain in her head was unbearable, but Sidony pushed it away and concentrated. "Was it not enough that I paid you the debt you owed to your previous employers? That I saved you from their incessant pursuit? What else could you possibly desire?" Reinhardt asked, his ire fully on Cyros again. "Nicholas, I need you to shut up and let me explain. Do you know what this is going to do to my standing in court? After I've dragged myself forward, you've knocked me even further from the throne." Their shouting was distracting, and Sidony screwed her eyes shut against the sound. She reached out with her magic, trying with everything she had to finish the spell Reinhardt had interrupted. A moment later, she felt it, a response from the room where they had found Reinhardt's wife. "Make her help you, Nicholas, if you don't quiet yourself." She could sense it leaving the room where they had discovered it, moving down the hall toward the parlor. "No, we're done, Cyros. If I have to throw you to the wolves along with the Mortalitasi, then I will—" It was outside the door, and Sidony beckoned it inside. "I didn't kill your wife, or the other bastards you hired me to kill either. Someone else got to all of them first, Nicholas. Someone who obviously knows what you are planning. The mage and I were trying to find out who—" Cyros cried out in surprise as Nicholas's scream echoed around the room, but neither of the men managed to drown out the sickening crunch of nails and teeth sinking into flesh. Sidony's eyes flew open just in time to see the corpse of Reinhardt's wife attack her husband. Lord Reinhardt howled in pain and confusion, his arms uselessly pulling at her rabid form, blood pouring from every gash his dead wife opened upon his body. Cyros's knife flew into his hand, and he quickly backed into the wall. Reinhardt's screams disappeared almost as soon as they began. His lifeless body crumpled, and the former Lady Reinhardt spun towards Cyros. His eyes darted to Sidony.
"Tell me."
Sidony pulled herself up uneasily.
"How many dead nobles did you hope to lay at the Mortalitasi's feet? At my feet? How many other necromancers did you plan to use? It must have felt like the Maker himself smiled upon you last night when he put 2 death mages right in your way."
Lady Reinhardt took a step forward. "I'm telling the truth, mage. I didn't do this." He gestured toward the walking corpse. "Any of it." His knuckles turned white around the hilt of his knife.
"But the Maker is smiling on me now. I was looking for an assassin,"
Sidony said. She jerked her head toward Lady Reinhardt's corpse, and it collapsed in a heap on the floor. Purplish-white fire erupted in Sidony's open palm. "And I found one." "Mage, stop!" Cyros stepped away from the wall and rushed toward her. "My name is not Mage!" She thrust her arm forward, tearing away her bonds, flinging the siphoning spell and hitting him square in the chest. The skin on his extremities turned dark purple, then black, as the curse drained the very life from his body. She waited until night had completely fallen before she left the apartment. None of the staff ever returned, so she sat inside with the corpses until she was sure she could escape the house without drawing outside attention. Under the cover of the moonless autumn night, she slipped out the back door without notice, except for the shadowy figure, still as death, its necrotic aura chilling her to the bone, waiting at the end of the street, watching. "I'm going to have an interesting report for Pentagast," she thought, as she turned and walked the opposite way. Henrik's body had been moved to the tomb that had waited for him since he joined the Mortalitasi order. Despite the horrific appearance of his mangled corpse, he seemed almost comfortable in the tableau the other death mages had arranged for him, sitting at a desk, surrounded by books on necromancy, alone. He had been wrong about the Mortalitasi planning to assassinate the nobles, another victim of Cyros's network of well-placed rumors and gossip, and she resented him for using that mistake to drag her back to the city that she hated, to protect the people that she despised. But buried deep below the resentment, she knew that he had called on her for help because he still trusted her. After all this time, even after she abandoned him, and she had failed to protect him, even after the many years he had kept her hidden away from vicious games the rest of Nevarra was playing outside the halls of the necropolis. She had begrudged his insistence that she join the Mortalitasi, hated his resistance to learning anything about the world outside Nevarra City, but she never wanted this for him. Before she returned to the Inquisition, and did everything in her power to never see Nevarra again, the least she could do was ensure she had reached his resting place. When she returned to the necropolis, she hadn't expected the other Mortalitasi to accept her apology for her previous behavior, but she was grateful when they did. To her surprise, one of the death mages, an older man with silver hair and a mustache, had happily escorted her to Henrik's tomb.
"I heard you came to say goodbye to dear Henrik,"
a bright voice rang out behind her. "No," Sidony said, turning to face Antonia as she entered the tomb. "I'm just making sure he's where he wanted to be." "Oh," the corner of Antonia's lips quirked upward.
"For a moment, I thought there might actually be some warm, sentimental feelings in there."
Antonia pointed to the center of Sidney's chest. Sidony hummed a response. She would soon be free of the woman's jibes.
"Since you are leaving us, again, I take it Cyros helped you find what you were looking for?"
Antonia asked. "He did," Sidony replied. "As far as you know." Antonia smiled.
"You did good work."
Sidony raised a brow.
"Killing Lord Reinhardt and his pet assassin,"
Antonia smiled.
"They would have brought chaos upon the kingdom if they had been allowed to see their plan through."
Sidony clenched her jaw. "Forgive me," she began, "but why did you say you knew about Reinhardt and Cyros? That is information I have not even reported to the Inquisition yet." Antonia carried on as if Sidony had never spoken.
"These nobles, responsible for guiding the country, and this is the example they set, to grow so desperate for power that they resort to climbing over each other's corpses to reach the throne. So many people tell me they are ready for change, for the kingdom to be taken into a new direction, without the uncertainty of the old royal blood and their constant struggles for control. With a line of succession in such disarray, maybe it's time for the Mortalitasi to intervene."
A stabbing cold ripped through Sidony, a chill that had nothing to do with her surroundings.
"I told you before, Sidony, the people of Nevarra, noble and common, know our worth. They see the value and counsel given by a Mortalitasi. Why, I could tell them the Maker himself willed their daughter to jump from a window, and they would believe me. They would find peace in that. I could say that there is no point in examining the crate of wine that killed the brother for poison, and they would trust in my wisdom."
She pointed a finger toward Henrik.
If I say the stuttering old recluse is dead because he's grown too fond of drinking during his experiments, no one will question me.
She turned back to Sidony.
And when I send the bitter, unpleasant girl to get a two-bit assassin and his upstart master out of my way, she will take them down for me. She will destroy them without even a second thought, and show the rest of Nevarra just how far the nobility is willing to go for power.
The chill seeped deeper into Sidney's bones. The weight of Antonia's words hung heavy in the silence. A tranquil smile illuminated Antonia's face, and her eyes glanced to Sidney's hand.
"Oh," she exclaimed, "my ring! You still have it."
Her hand extended towards Sidney. Eyes never leaving Antonia's, Sidney pulled the trinket from her finger. As she dropped the ring into her waiting palm, she felt it. The waves of death and decay, of a cold void emanating from the dark figure she'd come to recognize standing in the corner.
"You know,"
Antonia said, following Sidney's gaze to the corpse.
"When I learned that Henrik had sent for you, I was furious. The last thing I needed was a thorn in my side in the form of a churlish little deserter who abandoned the Mortalitasi. But you turned out to be useful after all,"
she said with the same calm smile. Antonia retreated from the tomb, the corpse that had haunted Sidney at every turn, cataloging her every movement, dutifully followed its mistress into the dark. Alone in the tomb, Sidney froze under the watch of Henrik's lifeless body, the man who had taught her everything she knew, whom she had rebelled against for years, stared vacantly at her from his resting place. Siros had used her. Even if he had never gotten the opportunity to pin the deaths of the nobles on her, he had still managed to run her ragged across Nevarra City, chasing a killer who was sabotaging his work and tarnishing his reputation. Rage flared within her as she thought of killing Siros and Nicholas. She thought she'd been preventing a political catastrophe on behalf of the Inquisition, but she had been nothing more than Antonia's pawn. Even Pentagast, in her own way, had used Sidney. Did it matter to her that Sidney wanted nothing to do with the fate of her home country? The Inquisitor does not want to see that happen to Nevarra. Or did it only matter that the Inquisitor was pleased? She met Henrik's blank, twisted expression. He had never been what she wanted, or even what she thought she needed. For most of her life, he had felt like a jailer instead of a father, or even a teacher. He had insisted she stay hidden away from the world, discouraged her from learning anything outside the lessons of death magic. But he had never used her. And now, she'd give anything to hear what he had to say. She could go to the other Mortalitasi, tell them what Antonia had done, but her standing with them was still precarious at best. It would be her word against that of a prominent Mortalitasi, one who could accuse an agent of the Inquisition of murdering a Nevarran lord without question. A situation Antonia would no doubt use to her benefit. And if Sidney removed Antonia from her own game, whose pawn would she become then? Who would be waiting in the wings to fill Antonia's place? In Nevarra, there would always be another waiting to climb over the ones who fell. The silence of Henrik's tomb was suffocating, as the dead man's stare became unbearable. It didn't matter if anyone else benefited from what happened to Antonia. Sidney couldn't take failing him again. The statues came alive that night. Countless points of light from candles at their bases and in the hands of revelers illuminated every crevice in every stone face, every wrinkle in the fabric draped around the stone bodies, every flower scattered at their feet. The autumn pageant all of Nevarra City had been preparing for was here, and every one of the city's residents filled the streets with laughter and dancing. The crowds were perfect for concealing Sidney as she walked the boulevard, but they made it almost impossible to find who she was looking for. But predictably, the brassy-haired, bright-faced death mage shone like a beacon, even among the masses. She was surrounded by admirers looking for counsel, for guidance, for just a smile, all of which Antonia freely gave. Sidney watched as the little girl she had given a stack of gold to approached Antonia, the letter Sidony had given her outstretched in her little hand. Antonia beamed, and when she took it, the girl ran in the opposite direction. The smile faded as Antonia read the crumpled parchment. What was she feeling as she read the words from Henrik's hand, the hand Sidony had easily reawakened for this purpose? Was it confusion? Fear? For the first time, Sidony saw Antonia's face darken. She excused herself from her enchanted audience and looked around, searching. But Sidony's face effortlessly blended into the crowd. Antonia turned and disappeared between two statues standing guard at the mouth of an abandoned back street, and Sidony followed. The darkness in the alleyway would mask the two mages from outside eyes, and the noise of the crowds would drown out Antonia's screams. And in the time it would take for someone to discover the Mortalitasi's body, Sidony would be too far from Nevarra City to hear their screams. They had met in an alley, and in an alley they would part. This has been Tevinter Nights, Murder by Death Mages. Written by Caitlin Sullivan Kelly and read by Kyle Bond. Thank you for listening.